Thank you again for joining us this afternoon or this morning. The opportunity to run this series of webinars arose thanks to a collaboration between the British Council in Spain and the Spanish network of publicly owned theatres, auditoriums, circuits, and festivals. We're so excited that our initial idea to showcase and share best practices and experiences taking place in the UK theatre sector in the fields of diversity and inclusion, sustainability and community has actually grown much further than just for a Spanish audience. And I'm happy to say that we've got people who've signed up from Argentina, from Cuba, Colombia, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Mexico, the Netherlands, Poland, and Romania. I think I've managed to remember everyone. I hope so. So I'm very pleased to introduce you now to Marta Monfort. Marta is the director of a network of city theatres in the city of Victoria, which is a city in the Basque Country in the north of Spain. And she is also the head of the International Committee about the Spanish Network of Theatres. So Marta will be chairing today's session on diversity and inclusion with guests Rachel Bagshaw and Devinda Da Silva. Marta, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristina. Buenas tardes, buenos días a todas y a todos. Yo soy Marta Monfort, como ha dicho Cristina. Aquí vengo en nombre de la Red Española de Teatros Públicos y de la Comisión Internacional que junto con el British Council ha organizado este seminario web. Yo soy morena, tengo 56 años, el pelo largo, voy vestida de negro y estoy muy bien rodeada de libros y de mis compañeras de la oficina María y Elvira. Así que bueno, de nuevo dar las gracias. Contamos hoy con dos proyectos y dos ponentes de lujo que son Rachel Bagshaw y Devinda De Silva. Como sabéis, estos seminarios web hoy es la primera cita, la siguiente será el 14 y el 21 de octubre. Pero hoy toca hablar de un tema muy interesante como es la diversidad y la inclusión. Yo creo que estos seminarios abordan ideas fuerza que necesariamente todos en nuestros espacios culturales debemos plantearnos para hacer nuestros teatros o nuestros centros de arte más transformadoras y más contemporáneas. Así que, bueno, voy a tener el placer, como digo, de empezar con un tema que yo creo que ya está normalizado e integrado en nuestro día a día, pero que todavía queda mucho, sin duda, por mejorar y por hacer. Ya os ha recordado Cristina cómo activar la traducción. Un poco el esquema de la presentación. Yo primero os voy a presentar ahora a Rachel y a Devinda. Cada uno tendrá un cuarto de hora para hablar. Después haremos una interacción entre los dos que yo moderaré y al final haremos el turno de preguntas para todas las personas que estáis participando. Recordaros a través del Q&A o de preguntas y respuestas, ¿de acuerdo? Así que bueno, de nuevo, gracias a todos. Es un placer que os interese este seminario. Creemos que estas prácticas y estos proyectos, tanto de Rachel como de Devinda, como de los siguientes ponentes, van a ser muy inspiradoras y seguro que entre todos podremos contribuir a mejorar nuestros espacios y nuestro trabajo diario. Bueno, pues vamos, si os parece, con Rachel Bagshaw. Rachel Bagshaw es una galardonada directora de escena. Recientemente ha sido nombrada directora artística del Unicorn Theatre, tras haber sido directora asociada entre 2018 y 2023. Ella también es residente en el National Theatre, como sabéis, la compañía nacional de teatro inglesa creada en 1962 por Laurence Olivier, gracias a la beca Peter Hall que ha tenido Rachel durante el curso 23-24. Como directora, Rachel debutó en el Globe Theatre en el 2024 dirigiendo The Duchess of Malfi de John Webster en el escenario precisamente de Sound Wanamaker. Sus producciones más recientes incluyen títulos como A Dead Bird House del Bristol Old Vic y el Winston Music Hall, Augmented en la Royal Exchange y la compañía Told by an Idiot, Let Loose con la coreógrafa Ariel Smith coproducida por el English National Ballet para Unicorn Theatre Online, pero además ha trabajado en otros espacios o festivales tan relevantes como el Royal Court o el Festival Unlimited. Su aclamada obra The Shape of Pain ganó un Fringe First en Edimburgo y se reestrenó en el Battersea Arts Centre en 2018. Además de esta prolífica actividad en el campo escénico, ella también tiene una actividad muy interesante en el mundo del cine. Y bueno, seguro que todos conocéis el Unicorn Theatre, aunque ahora Rachel nos lo va a explicar. Es un espacio escénico que tiene centrada la gestión de audiencias de niños de 0 a 13 años con un planteamiento participativo y transformador, con textos clásicos, con visiones contemporáneas, donde la igualdad, la diversidad y la inclusión son las ideas fuerzas que dan identidad a este espacio. Así que un placer, Rachel, tenerte aquí. Cuando quieras, empieza tu tiempo y estamos todos muy ilusionados de escuchar ese maravilloso proyecto. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. I'm just going to try and start my presentation. So bear with me as I manage to share my screen. Here we go. So thank you so much, Christina and Marta, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. As Marta said, I'm Rachel Bagshaw. I'm the Artistic Director of the Unicorn Theatre in London. The Unicorn is a children's theatre as described, so we make work for 0 to 14-year-olds, both in our building and across the UK, and also globally with our digital programme of work as well. Prior to running the Unicorn, I have been a freelance director for about 15 years. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about my journey in both becoming a director and what has shaped me in that journey, and then talk through a few of my projects of mine. So it's going to be a two-part presentation. Half of the presentation is going to just talk a little bit about my journey into theatre and how I've become the artist I am and the way I work now. And the second part, I'm going to just talk through a few of the shows that I've made over the past few years as a sort of journey through access and a different kinds of approaches to access in theatre. So, apologies, I've had a slight technical hitch. Oh, can I just check? Can you still see my? Presentation? Yes. Oh, good. Okay. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about space and about how I have come to change the spaces in which I work, and about what we need as artists and as humans in order to do this. And this is quite challenging for me to talk about. It's been a really long journey through many different iterations of space. It's been a challenging journey that's still going. And so I need a bit of cushioning to get through this. So the cushioning that I need is a squishy space with soft corners and room to move around in. And the object that has fundamentally changed my access, my practice, and the space in which I work is a beanbag. The beanbag comes everywhere with me. It comes to the office, the rehearsal room, and the theatre. I love it, and I love how it holds me as I work. This hasn't always been my reality. I've lived with chronic pain for more than 20 years, and it has inevitably had a profound impact on my work, taking many different approaches to it throughout. In my student days, I pushed myself to keep up with my peers, exhausting myself beyond what my body is capable of. I compensated for a lack of physical access. I climbed stairs, literal and metaphorical, to keep going. And in my 20s, this pushing turned into something else. I pushed against the industry I was so desperate to work in. Directing, which is what I wanted to do, just felt impossible. So many places weren't physically available to me, and I couldn't keep up. Working as an emerging artist in London, often in the assistant director role, the spaces were always defined by someone else. They were defined by the director, the producer, or even the venue. Sometimes I was invited to do what I needed for me, but even when I was in physically accessible environments, changing the way we worked in the room just felt impossible. I began doubting that I could work in a sector that felt so at odds with the rest that my body needs. And then about 10 years ago, I began working on a show idea about living with pain. Everything needed rethinking. Talking about pain makes my pain worse. How could I make a piece of work? Okay, sorry, I've just been asked to just change the view of my screen, which I'm trying to do. Okay, so then a few years ago, I began working on a show idea about living with pain. And as I was just saying, everything needed rethinking. Talking about pain makes my pain worse. How could I make a piece of work that did this to my body within the existing structures? And then the answer came along, the beanbag. At first, the beanbag was brought into the room for physical ease. I can sit on it, I can lie on it, rest on it. It started infiltrating every space. It came into rehearsals, into our technical rehearsals, came in the van when I was away from home. We began asking theatres to take seats out for me to bring it into the space. Gradually, it became the single most important tool in my access kit. I can rest well, and when my body is rested, so too are my mind and creativity. I can be my best self from there. And then I started noticing something else. This choice of seating, made pragmatically, began shifting into a way of working. The beanbag changes the shape of the way in which I work, which in turn changes the way everyone around me works. The power balance shifted. Quite literally, in a room with beanbags, we work in a horizontal structure because I am horizontal. That shift in power finds its ways into the work. My rehearsal process has become more collaborative, not led from the top. The room is more malleable. Just as the beanbag moves around, so too do we in the space. We're not fixed towards working towards a set of chairs and tables. And we become more playful. The childlike quality of a beanbag engenders a softness, a silliness, a gentleness with each other. And this journey hasn't been easy. Although so many places have been supportive of the practical decision, the reality of the beanbag way of working has been challenging to some organisations. With it comes a heightened awareness of pacing, the need for rest, of a duty of care to the room. The beanbag space isn't just a working space for me, it's also often a learning space for others who might resist it. And so no longer do I push everyone through just to get things done and make the show. And sometimes that is at odds with those who want things to happen a certain way. One of those people who wanted things to be a certain way was me. It took me years to bring the beanbag into the room. And that has a lot to do with vulnerability. I needed to rest, but I did not want to be vulnerable. I did not want to lie down to work. I was ashamed and afraid to be seen as weak or failing. I thought that to lead, I needed to be strong and that I had to hold the power in the room. But I have realised that my being vulnerable encourages openness in others, and that in turn is feeding the way we all work. My work has become so different once I realised that. The beanbag has become an unlikely symbol of resilience for me. It's soft and squishy. It changes shape with me. It molds to me and it supports me. It's like a gentle cocoon holding me and cushioning me. The beanbag doesn't judge. It's my ally. I feel safe when I'm in it. And the beanbag is the shape of what I want my practice to be, what resilient space can be. The more resilient that space is for us all, then the deeper the work can go. Recently, I've been appointed a year ago in my new role as Artistic Director at the Unicorn. And after years of leading creative spaces, this is my first time leading a whole organisation. And the appointment has brought a welcome and unexpected level of care from the organisation. They are so keen to put the right access in place for me. And the beanbag is part of this package. It takes up space in my new office shared with my exec team. And I've been struck once again by how I could only do this once I had reached a stage in my career of being able to set the terms myself. How with this power comes the responsibility to enable others to have access to their own individual ways of working. So the power of the beanbag is huge. It can change the space I'm in just by being me. And that allows for others to be the version of themselves they need to be. I really believe in the idea of imperfect access. Perhaps we can't offer everyone everything all of the time, but we can open up space for different models of working. So I have a question of provocation to you, which is how can we cultivate spaces which hold different ways of working? Who gets to have their own beanbag or whatever that beanbag is for you? How can we shift space? And I kind of like to imagine a future world full of beanbags, of different ways of working, which cultivates a new way of working, an inclusive way of working, and a space that is defined by those access models themselves. So that's part one of what I wanted to share today, which is the slightly more scripted part. And now I'm going to talk you through a little bit how that has then manifested in practice in my work. So I want to start firstly just by bringing in an idea here, which is the PACE model, P-A-C-E. Oh, sorry, before I do, I realised I didn't describe myself, in a terrible mood talking about access. So firstly, I'm just going to pause and describe myself. So yeah, I'm Rachel. I am a white woman in my 40s. I have shoulder length blonde hair and I'm wearing an orange cardigan and a brown t-shirt. And apologies for not doing that at the top of my speech, of my presentation. The PACE model was developed by a psychologist called Dan Hughes and has become really, really influential for me in terms of how I think space and spaces and creative spaces can and should run. And the P stands for playfulness, the A for acceptance, C for curiosity, and E for empathy, or I sort of prefer the word compassion, but then it becomes PAC, which isn't quite as satisfying. And that those four words, those four ideas are really sort of the cornerstones of how I approach not just the rehearsal room and the work that I'm making, but also leading an organisation, and to approach everything I do with playfulness, with acceptance, to be curious and compassionate. Just to talk a little bit then about access and theatre in the UK. So historically, the UK has got a very, very engaged disabled artists movement. We've got a lot of leading disabled theatre organisations making work. And through the 80s, and one of the terms that has been sort of really coined by the disabled movement is nothing about us without us. So the idea of making work not for an audience, but with an audience. So I like to think about this in ways of how we might make work, a little bit of how I'm sort of talking about kind of consulting with my own body and my own process. So I think about consultation, I think about having conversation, and I think about collaboration. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how that is coming into the work that we're doing at the Unicorn too. But that idea of how do we make work, nothing about us without us, how do we make work that consults, that has conversations with, that talks to and collaborates with its audience. It also means that we're centering people and their experiences. So we center those for whom the work is, that we centre people about whom the work is. And that all of this doesn't mean that our work is any less ambitious or creative. It's absolutely about holding ambition and creativity at the forefront of the work that we're making. And when I was thinking about presenting today, I really wanted to share the first half, the sort of what I kind of call the beanbag manifesto, and this sort of first half of the presentation about how the beanbag has really fundamentally shifted the way I've worked. But what I was also then reflecting on is how my engagement with creative access has evolved over a number of shows. And so I started talking about a show that I made, which was about living with chronic pain, which was absolutely a really formative moment for me creatively, in terms of exploring really fully access in a creative form and what it really meant to engage with access for an audience through kind of myriad layers of creativity. So I'm going to start talking with that show in mind. So The Shape of the Pain is a show that I made in collaboration with another writer, Chris Thorpe, and it toured and went to Edinburgh in 2017. It was a one-woman show about the experience of living with pain, and it used layers and layers of theatre language, just as many other shows do, to create the experience of pain. But in the making of it, what we were really trying to get into the experience of is how do we create a full-bodied experience of living with chronic pain, and how do the access tools, in this case, in the image that we've got up on screen here, how do the access tools of creative captioning really resonate and kind of reflect the experience of the pain. The show has a really detailed sound design, and so it was really, really important that the captions and the video language really reflected the sound design and really spoke to the sound design, so that what we created was an experience that was really, really, truly representative of the sound design for deaf audiences through the captioning. In the journey of this show, we also started off by writing an audio description script for visually impaired and blind audiences. And we really were intending to make this show with a very specific way of delivering that. So with headphones, and it would be delivered alongside every show, and every show was going to have this fully integrated audio description experience. And then what we realized in the making of the show was that the audio description on headsets got in the way of the experience of hearing the sound of the show. And so quite late on in the journey of the show, we made the decision, for, again, with consultation, nothing about us without us, in consultation and collaboration with a visually impaired theatre maker, we made the quite radical decision to cut the audio description entirely from the show. So it was a case of where the access was being made with really good intentions to serve a particular audience. Actually, what it was doing was getting in the way of making the show. And so to make the show more accessible, we had to remove a layer of access. So it's a really, really brilliant learning experience in terms of not of keeping open to possibilities all the way through a creative process. And move on to talk about a show that I made in 2019, and this was a show, Midnight Movie, by the writer Eve Lee, which has actually had a few outings in Europe across various theatres. It's fascinating because it's a really personal story by Eve, or a personal piece of work about her experience of being awake in the night and kind of living through an online world. And to make this show, in order again to explore the layers and layers of experience that Eve was facing, we used layers of performance languages. So we had a speaking actor, we had a British Sign Language using actor, we had captions, and huge audio-visual language. So this was about a way of creating access points, big, really active access points that gave the audience not only roots into Eve's experience as she'd written it, but also creating access points that, for deaf, for visually impaired audiences, and also for those, just bear with me one moment. Apologies, thank you. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about Augmented. Seem to have a habit of making one-person shows, or in a series of shows, I made several one-person shows in a row. Augmented was a show made and written by Sophie Woolley, performed by Sophie. Sophie is a deaf writer and performer with a cochlear implant fitted, and she considers herself to be a deaf cyborg. She describes herself as. She is essentially part robot. She has a cochlear implant, and she can do all sorts of magic tricks with her cochlear implant, like listening to things that are going on in other spaces by placing sneaky microphones in the room. She's a very sneaky person to spend time with because you're never quite sure what she's listening to. She made a show, Augmented, which was about her experience of becoming deaf and then also becoming hearing. And we, again, made what we wanted to do was fully explore the access languages at the heart of the show. I want to talk a little bit about what we did here with the audio description. What we wanted to explore with the layers of access in this show was the profoundly personal experience of losing access to work and then regaining it. And so what we decided to create with the audio description was, for a show that was touring, what we needed to do was create a pre-recorded audio description that was delivered on headsets that was then, and what we came up with was that the first part of the show was delivered as a very, very neutral description delivered by a third person. So the performer walks across the space, she picks up a book, she sits on a chair. It was all very neutral. And in the moment in the story where Sophie's cochlear implant is switched on and she regains her hearing, the audio description in the headsets switched to first person and was delivered by Sophie. And it was a really electric creative discovery of how to find agency in the access language, where Sophie herself was able to describe her own access journey, her own experience of the show. I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to talk I then started bringing the work that I'd been doing that up until this point had been much more specifically related to deaf and disabled stories into much more what we might consider mainstream storytelling. And so this is an example here of a show I made in 2022, A Dead Body in Towers by the writer David Farr, which was produced at Bristol Old Vic Theatre. And here the captions became a form of storytelling where they really helped us to actually practically locate us in time and in space. They helped to guide the audience through the narrative of the show, so much the way that a video design of another piece of theatre might do. But here the captions made in a video design were also really specifically locating time, place. They helped to move us around a piece that sort of told the history of sort of 50 years of the second part of the 20th century. And so they really, the kind of languages here became so much more based in the narrative of the show and really informed by the narrative of the show. Finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about a show I made at the start of this year, which was a production of The Duchess of Malfi by John Webster, which was at Shakespeare's Globe in their indoor space, the San Wanamaker. This is a candlelit space. And it was the first time anybody has captioned with alongside candlelight, not with candles, but we captioned alongside candlelight. And again, to what we were really doing with this show was leaning into the architecture of the space. For anybody who has visited the Globe, there's a very, very particular architecture to these spaces that are historically representative of theatres of their time. And so how to caption in those spaces, how to bring access into those spaces when they were made not to be accessible at all. And so what we have here is the Duchess of Malfi was played by an actress of short stature, Francesca Mills. We made a set that was entirely built the right size for Fran. So the stairs, the doors, everything about it was built in an accessible way for Fran and made harder for the male characters in her life, until the point at which the men start kind of infiltrating, having an impact, and then they really changed and shifted the experience of that. And again, we looked at sort of using historically relevant fonts as part of the captioning language for that show. So it's what we can see on the image here was historically relevant fonts. Just to talk very, very briefly at the end about the how access in theatre for young audiences is developing. The future at the Unicorn Theatre. This is an area that could be a whole other 2 hours in and of itself. It's really, really early days in terms of making work for young audiences that is accessible, because a young person's experience of theatre is even more developing than an adult, and we're still at the sort of early days of all of this creative experience. And so every show that we're developing over my first season at the Unicorn, we're looking at specific access routes in. So the show itself might not be fully captioned, or we might not be able to have sign language at every single performance, but we're looking at really small interventions that we can make, like having actors record audio descriptions of themselves and for every show, and that they will sit on our website. Small, tiny interventions that don't cost us a lot of money, because we don't have a huge amount of money in my building. But how can we make those really creative, efficient interventions that open up our theatre to wider audiences? So just to, again, to pose that question, so arts and access in Europe and beyond, what do we want to be in our future? And how can we change and shape the theatre that we make with everybody in mind? Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Muchas gracias. La verdad es que luego abriremos una interacción entre tú y Devinda una vez que oigamos su intervención, para tratar de encontrarnos retos. Tú has lanzado unos cuantos, y de que todos los asistentes lo puedan compartir. Vamos con Devinda De Silva. Devinda, él cuenta con más de 20 años de experiencia en el ámbito del cambio social. Ha trabajado en colaboración con comunidades de Gales y en todo el mundo, centrándose en las artes y su capacidad para abordar la desigualdad, desarrollando prácticas basadas en la co-creación y en el fomento de la mayor participación y de la significación de los espacios, ¿no? Devinda fue miembro fundador del National Theatre Wales, del Teatro Nacional de Gales, un modelo de espacio abierto a los artistas y al teatro que nos hace preguntas y nos transforma, donde la comunidad es el centro, y donde también ejerció como director de colaboración durante más de 10 años, dirigiendo la creación y el desarrollo de un maravilloso programa llamado Team. El enfoque único de la compañía para trabajar con las comunidades, donde proponen que cualquier persona, independientemente de su edad, raza, origen o capacidad, puede y debe tener acceso al arte y a la creación. Actualmente, Devinda codirige el desarrollo de una nueva estrategia cultural para Gales por encargo del gobierno galés. Así que, Devinda, muchas gracias. Estamos con muchas ganas de escuchar tu proyecto y tu experiencia, y somos todo oídos para ti. Muchas gracias. Recuerda hacer tu descripción física.
I'm a middle-aged man, middle-aged brown man. I have black hair and a grey beard, and I'm wearing a blue jumper. Thank you very much, Marta, and thanks, Rachel, for your presentation. Hopefully I can follow that up. I'll just see if I can share my screen. Can everyone see that? Can we see that? Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming along. As Marta described me probably better than I can describe myself. So today I'm going to talk about the work I've been involved in around diversity and inclusion. For the purpose of today, that diversity and inclusion will be in the context of ethnic and cultural diversity. And most of what I'm going to talk about is the work I did at National Theatre Wales, for thinking about who we were, what we created, how we worked, and finish off talking about what I think we achieved. Through this, I want to really tell the stories about some of the communities and people we worked with, really what changed for them over a space of around 15 years. As one of the first points I want to make is to do this kind of work properly takes time. So just a bit of context about Wales. Wales has a population of around 3 million people. It's largely rural. It has a black and minority ethnic community of around 5%. And they're generally based around the larger cities. So National Theatre Wales was created in 2009. It was created with the overall goal of developing English language theatre in Wales. And it was conceived as a flexible, non-building based theatre. What that meant was we weren't based in a building, we weren't based in a theatre. And the idea behind this was that we could locate ourselves in anywhere around Wales or actually anywhere in the world. So this is really important first point about National Theatre Wales. The decision was made right from the start that the National Theatre in Wales wouldn't be represented by a large, grand building. It would be national in the sense that it would be owned by the people of Wales and they would play a part in it. I think one thing I want to say about National Theatre Wales, as compared to maybe other places I've worked with, was about the leadership. So the chair, the board, our artistic director, when we talk about things about like values, things like diversity, inclusion, all those things were really important to them. And that leadership, it felt that it filtered down throughout the whole organization. And everyone bought into it. It was like a given that National Theatre Wales would deal with issues around diversity and inclusion. I just want to talk to you through a few of our shows. We created over 50 shows, and most of our work, as mentioned, was site located. We described our work really from the epic to the intimate. So first one of our epic shows was called City of the Unexpected. This was based in Cardiff, Wales's capital city, over 2 days. And at the time, it was the largest participatory arts event in the UK, and around 250,000 people watched it. In addition to that, we involved around 2,000 local performers. The show we're probably most well known for was The Passion. The Passion ran over 3 days in a place called Port Talbot. Now, Port Talbot is a place in South Wales with a population of around 35,000 people. It was co-directed by Michael Sheen and involved around 2,000 local performers, and its finale was watched by around 10,000 people. So to the other extreme, to the more intimate shows we put on, this was a show called The Persians, which is Europe's oldest surviving play. We staged this in the hills of mid Wales in a mock-up village used by the army, where troops are trained in urban warfare. It's never been open to the public before, and no one lives in it. This is a show called The Gathering. We made this with sheep farmers in rural Wales. We took the audience on a 4-hour journey. They were guided by sheep farmers, and we used the landscape to tell an ancient story. So moving on from that, things like shows which have perhaps a more obvious focus on diversity and inclusion. which I think were both epic and intimate. So this is a show called The Soul Exchange, and this was done in the Bute Town area of Cardiff, and it followed the journey of a man in search of his long-lost father and his roots. So audiences took a taxi ride around the streets of Bute Town, and they ended up in a place called the Coal Exchange, which was where the first £1 million cheque was signed. Just to give you a bit of background around Bute Town, so Bute Town is an area of Cardiff. It has one of the UK's oldest and largest Somali populations. It's one of the most diverse communities in the United Kingdom, and it's said that 47 different languages are spoken in 1 square mile. A lot of people were surprised that in our first year we were going to do a show in Bute Town, and that includes the people who live there. So moving on, another show which had a bit more of a focus on diversity and inclusion was called Digabe. That translates as the poem in Somali, and this was our 23rd show. Again, this was a site-specific show performance in the Bute Town area of Cardiff. So over the course of a day, people experienced the show, which took them all around Bute Town. And what I think was important with this show was people opened up their homes to tell them stories about their lives in Bute Town. And people in the area were really keen that people from the outside could view them for what they were. And they talked about their history and their place in Wales. I think the point I like to make here is that as a national theatre, we wanted to tell stories about Wales, but there's always a choice in what stories you tell, and also whose stories you're going to tell. It kind of felt for me at the time that we were kind of telling stories about a Wales of now, not something really like rooted in the past, but it was something we show that kind of looked into the future, and also we got the communities to tell their own stories. So I just want to talk a little bit about the thinking behind our approach. One thing people find surprising is that we never really created a piece of work or ran any project which focused specifically on diversity or inclusion. We really wanted to kind of leave that thinking behind because very often it's very short term. So things like engagement, community, diversity and inclusion were made a core part of our work. It would be everyone's responsibility within the organisation, not just the creative side, but also finance, marketing and administration. I guess we wanted the same approach adopted across the whole organisation all the time. In essence, we wanted this kind of thinking, this work to be part of our culture. So what we did was we didn't want to think about diversity as it's out there on its own. We wanted to think of diversity as a part of a range of initiatives. So what we tried to do was create a model for an organisation which reflected that. So the model we created was about developing a different relationship between an arts organisation and the communities it worked with. And it was a model where people, the communities we worked with, were able to influence the organisation at every single level. And this addressed something at the very heart of our work, that power balance between communities and an arts organisation. Looking a bit further into that model, I think with hindsight, I think our success around the levels, our success really sort of was brought about by the levels and depths of participation we encouraged. It felt unique at the time because we addressed things around equality of opportunity and diversity at 3 different levels. The first level was access. We wanted to make access to National Theatre Wales as easy as possible. So with a model with no permanent building meant that we were accessible and visible in communities. People could get to know us on their terms in their area. We didn't have to rely on them coming through our doors, coming into our building, trying to drag them in. I think on a day-to-day level, we also did things like we had an open office. Anyone could come in and use our office at any time. We'd operate a go and see policy. So anyone who invited us to their show, their performance, we would guarantee someone from National Theatre Wales would come to see it. We also knew at the time that if anyone contacted us, and that included our artistic director, they would get a reply. If someone emailed us, they would get a reply. The second part around that inequality, which I think is probably the most important part around National Theatre Wales, was people's access to our decision making. We really want to support and allow individuals from across Wales to become the key decision makers at every level in the organisation. So they were central to developing the artistic programme. They told us what they thought of our shows. They'd visit rehearsals. They'd be represented on our board. They'd have a say on who we recruit and who we work with. In short, they shaped the whole organisation. And through this, we hope they get a real sense of ownership. And it was about building that relationship with the communities. So that's pretty one-sided. So in return, we felt we would support the community or the people we work with in a number of ways. So our approach works with people and groups to influence all of NTW's planning, but also allow them to take the lead in developing activities for their own people, for their own communities. What we did initially was we would give people a small amount of money to support an idea they'd have. All we'd ask is that the idea would benefit their community. So people would put on their own training sessions, their own social events, own poetry readings, theatre nights. Some people also some communities also created a choir. Underpinning this was that they would always get the support they needed to run those events. The second part, how I think we supported communities, was developing and supporting a network. So this was really about setting up a new community. And we always believed in the power of a network, and everyone who got involved with National Theatre Wales were encouraged to support each other. They'd share their skills and knowledge and develop new partnerships. One thing we realised was that however talented you are, if you're from a certain background, it's really hard to break into theatre. So what we tried to ensure was that people from all over Wales got the chance to meet people from more traditional theatre backgrounds who they might not have met otherwise. And we tried to break down those barriers, and we tried to persuade them or encourage them to create work together. The third part really was around what I touched on before, was long-term thinking. What I think everyone at National Theatre realised was that projects dealing with diversity and inclusion are usually short-term and based around a show or a project. What we wanted to develop was ways that work around diversity and inclusion but continued long past any shows. So to give you a better idea of whether that worked or not, about how that worked in practice, I just want to talk about the legacy of our show Soul Exchange, which we did in our first year, and how that led to the Gabby. So once we finished the Soul Exchange, the community we work with, we encouraged them to stay in touch. We all said our doors are open. If you have an idea, come and talk to us. And a few months later, 5 poets who you see here, who had small parts in the Soul Exchange, came through the doors of National Theatre Wales and said they wanted to make a show, and that show turned into Dig Abbey. What I think was important here was how we approached this show, and the most significant thing was, as far as possible, we let the poets in the community make all the decisions around it. For example, they decided who was a director, who was on the creative team, what marketing looked like, and so on. And this was what I mentioned before, was to kind of giving up some of that power an arts organisation would have. One thing we did, which we hadn't done before, was set up a group of people from the community who would also make decisions around the show and really support NTW and support the poets to make it. So during our time making De Gabe, the poets were really keen on involving young people. So this is a photo of them actually running a homework club for young people in the community. This is a photo of them running a theatre workshop. Having listened to the community, what I think was a really good idea, which came from the poets, they realised that young people in the community weren't particularly bothered about theatre, but they really enjoyed football. And so what we did was that we sponsored a football team in the area. And what I think was particularly great about this, and something we wouldn't have thought of ourselves, was it broke down that barrier between National Theatre Wales and young people in that community. It wasn't a hard sell, get involved with us, but they already had an introduction to National Theatre Wales. So when we did want to talk to them about projects, they already knew who we were. So if Soul Exchange was part one, De Gabe was part two, 7 or 8 years later, talking about the young people we got involved in the area, they got involved in a project with us called The Agency. So The Agency was a partnership with Battersea Arts Centre in London and Contact Theatre in Manchester. And The Agency was a brilliant project. And it was about young people using the skills they gained from the arts to develop their entrepreneurial skills. They'd set up businesses in the community and NTW would support them to develop those businesses. One thing also we talked a lot about, and what we tried to do at National Theatre Wales, was develop a new generation of theatre makers. And finally, I just want to quickly talk about this. So this is a shot from a show called Circle of Fifths, which we did probably 13 years after the Soul Exchange. And this was created by a creative, an artist called Gavin Porter, who got involved with us, first of all, through the Soul Exchange, but then went on to create a show called Circle of Fifths for National Theatre Wales. Throughout those 13 years, Gavin had opportunities with National Theatre Wales, but also opportunities with other organisations in the sector. And this is something we were really keen on. We really wanted to have a sectoral change. It was no point just then for work we were doing supporting these kinds of artists, because there's only so many opportunities we could have. So this show, Circle of Fifths, by Gavin Porter, toured around Wales and toured into the UK. And I would like to leave it there. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, Devinda. It's incredibly your project. Congratulations also. La verdad es que tanto la propuesta de Rachel como tu propuesta, bueno, cada una de su manera habla de la inclusión, de la diversidad, de la participación, de la escucha, del arraigo, pero al final manejamos todos un lenguaje común. A mí me ha llamado mucho la atención, Rachel, a partir de tus beanbags, de tus puffs, como decía el intérprete, ¿no? Cómo de esa manera hemos transformado los espacios y transformamos también la manera de relacionarnos, la manera de crear de una manera más horizontal, ¿no? Y me ha llamado la atención que yo creo que esto es muy... da mucha luz tanto a aquellas personas que participan o lideran espacios culturales como a los creadores y creadoras, ¿no? el que no haya espacios fijos, ¿no? Y atender, cuidar, descansar, no empujar, sin presión, algo horizontal. La verdad es que yo creo que es una manera de liderar, de crear, incluso de educar, ¿no? Me refiero de crear una familia, una relación maravillosa, ¿no? También pace, la palabra pace en la segunda parte de tu ponencia, donde nos has contado un poco toda la trayectoria de tus obras, que la verdad ha sido súper interesante y maravillosa. Eh, mm, Creo que también es muy importante y todos podemos apuntarnos esta manera, ¿no? Esta forma de liderar y de trabajar, ¿no? Siendo lúdica, aceptando, siendo curiosa y empatizando, ¿no? Yo creo que, bueno, del mismo modo se puede trasladar a la propuesta que nos ha hecho Devinda, ¿no? Sobre ese maravilloso proyecto del Teatro Nacional de Gales, donde de nuevo la escucha, la participación, el preguntar, el coparticipar, ¿no? Me ha llamado mucho la atención porque yo creo que en nuestro país, por lo menos, esto es una asignatura muy pendiente, si bien vamos dando pasitos grandes a nivel de accesibilidad y de inclusión, normalizando los contenidos inclusivos en nuestras programaciones y haciendo nuestros espacios y nuestras agrupaciones más accesibles. Creo que una de las asignaturas pendientes es cómo gestionar la toma de decisiones con estas comunidades artísticas, ¿no? Esto casi es una pregunta, pero bueno, primero vamos a atender, si os parece, a las preguntas del foro, de los participantes que hay, pero creo que has dado en el clavo en esta manera de escuchar de nuevo y de poder hacer toda esta serie de proyectos creativos desde algo que estas comunidades puedan considerar como un valor y como algo de ellos y con lo que puedan enganchar, ¿no? y empatizar. La verdad es que nos dan mucha envidia vuestros dos proyectos, son maravillosos. Si os parece, podríamos empezar contestando a las preguntas que hay del foro. Si vemos que luego para el flujo de preguntas, tenemos aquí una propuesta para poder un poco seguir conociendo más sobre el proyecto tanto de Rachel como de Devinda. ¿Os parece? Vayamos a ir así. Bien, la primera pregunta es para Rachel. Dice, bueno, lovely work, Rachel. I'm just starting to create accessible theater programs and shows. And my question is, sorry, how do you ensure the recorded audio descriptions is synced with the show that is going on live?
So my technical knowledge will start to run out very soon in the answer to this question. Essentially, what we do is build it as part of the technical show file, and it is queued as part of the sound design. So it's very much synced to the lighting design and the sound design, and it's kind of built as part of the show from the very start. Like I said, how that then gets to the headphones is the sort of like theatre magic bit that as a director I don't fully understand, but lots of clever technical people make that stuff happen. But that it's made as part of the whole design of the show, and that's really important that is how we make these shows, because it means that the access is fully integrated into every aspect of the show. It's not sort of sitting somewhere else in a system, it's sitting in the like I say, fully in the design of the show. And the same is true of the captions as well, so the whole thing is operated and held by the whole team.
Thank you, Rachel. Another question for Rachel. Later on, we have two more for Devinda, and we will see. For Rachel, are these performances keen on traveling in other countries? Actually, the question is, Is there an international interest in for touring, and what difficulties, if any, may a producer have in mind, like translation or text to other languages?
Yeah, I think at the moment, sadly, not really any of these shows are available for touring, but more wanting to use them as useful examples to talk about kind of access in practice, in creative practice. We have like I said, Midnight Movie and The Shape of the Pain as texts have been performed in other languages, and there have been other productions of both of those shows. With Midnight Movie in particular, what Eve, the writer, has written into the text is a really open invitation in terms of it is partly a creative provocation. It is to be performed by no fewer than two and as performers and in as many languages as the company decides. So there's a really quite open kind of invitation from Eve for the text to be played with, and in terms of how it is made accessible in other places and by other companies. And in terms of translation of text, again, we have taken work elsewhere and worked on translation of text. It's, again, very technically, it can get quite challenging because the way in which those shows, certainly the captions, the way in which the shows have been developed and built, they're kind of built around, obviously, around the English language, but it is doable and has been done. Yeah. And I think, you know, we have talked about, although not done yet, how creative captions could also just exist as a translation layer. So actually one could take one of these shows and it could be performed in the English language and the captions be translated into other texts, although that hasn't been done as much, I would say. It has been done in this country quite a lot with sign language performances, but less so translation across languages, spoken languages.
Thank you, Rachel. Now is Devinda's turn. A couple of questions for you. First, you talk about building a relationship with the community by inviting them to rehearsals and asking for feedback. How do you manage feedback from the community regarding the turnout of a show while maintaining your creative identity?
Good question. The whole of, I think, for National Theatre Wales, especially, a lot of the work, whilst it was in, say, development, was developed with a vision which the community had fed into. Something which Rachel touched on, what we were really keen on was that thing around excellence. We would still create excellent work, but it would still have a really strong community feel. So I think we were open, always open, and listened to the community on their feedback, and they got things right. I was definitely with NTW. I was in meetings where community members didn't want to see a show performed by NTW. They were given options of, should we do this, that, and the other, and they didn't want to see one, and they wanted to see another, which perhaps people didn't understand at the time, but they were right. We took their advice and they were right. So I think it's about trust. A big thing is about trusting the community and trusting their views, and trusting their take on what they want to see.
Thank you, Devinda. Another question for you. Given the ethnic diversity of the areas your work shows, do you also use different languages, is only or English or Welsh?
No, I describe Wales as a multilingual country. It's described a lot as bilingual. So there's Welsh language and there's the English language, but there's a load of other languages spoken mainly within the bigger cities. So take that into account. Definitely with Digabe, there was a Somali in the script, the title translated from Somali, and taking into account also just practical things like getting the word out to people in the community. We'd use other languages. We'd use people within the community who spoke those languages and paid them to develop copy and promotional stuff for us. So communication, it was always a really big thing, and you needed to communicate with people in the areas you worked with, otherwise no one would come and see the show.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question for Devinda. It's incredible to see a national theatre without a fixed space. We have a lot of wonder theatre in Germany, much of it state supported, and in France as well, and in Spain. Is your practice also informed by this style of theatre as well?
Yes, very much so. I think it's hard to sort of, I think everyone at National Theatre Wales came from a load of different backgrounds and a load of different influences. I think the decision was made that we wouldn't be based in a theatre right from the start, but everyone who started working there, their influences, they understood historically what has gone before it along those lines, and drew inspiration from that, but also molded it to something which was very specific to Wales. But I think our artistic director and our creative team at the time had a range of influences, and they had worked internationally with a load of really, really brilliant companies as well. So all those influences came together to create National Theatre Wales.
Good. Now a question for both of you, okay? You can share it. In the process of making theatre accessible, where from whom have you found the most resistance? And how have you faced those obstacles? Rachel first.
That's a really interesting question. I think some of the resistance can be from usually from buildings who perceive that theatre or art is for a particular audience, and even then, sometimes if that work is then programmed in a building or and works with a particular audience, there then can be some resistance from an audience. It was really interesting with the Duchess of Malfi at the Globe, of watching audiences, the sort of more traditional Globe audience going to see something that was creatively captioned and coming in and feeling their physical resistance to it at the start of the show, that they perhaps didn't know it was going to be captioned or going to have disabled performers in it, and that feeling their bodies change over the course of the show and feeling them lean into the show and kind of, you know, really engage with it and really engage with the beauty of the access language in the space. But yeah, definitely, I think from buildings who or organizations who perceive theatre and art to be for particular people, I would say. Devinda.
I totally agree with what you said. I think what I'd add is that what I found, I think what we saw at National Theatre Wales is it's a different way of working for many people who have worked in theatre for a very long time. And you will get resistance. And some of that resistance is some of those people don't want to see change because they've been working in theatre for the past 30, 40 years, and why, you know, perhaps they think they're gonna get less work, or they think work is going to be made which is not going to have them involved. And I think that was where we got most resistance, I think, from a more traditional theatre makers.
seguro. Vamos ahora con los
Marta,
proyectos de mediación que seguro los dos desarrolláis, bueno, si nos lo habéis contado en vuestros espacios, ¿no? Es algo que en algunos países es incipiente y todavía, sobre todo en los teatros públicos, es casi como difícil, complicado de hacer ver que es fundamental y necesario. Nos gustaría saber en vuestros proyectos de mediación cuánta gente tenéis trabajando, qué presupuestos, cuáles son sus tareas, si tenéis seguro que sí un plan de acción, cómo abordáis este trabajo.
Sorry, when you mean, say, mediation projects, is that?
Sí, me refiero a vincularse con las comunidades de manera diferente, sobre todo lo que habéis hecho en el Teatro Nacional de Gales, darles voz a las comunidades, mostrarles cosas que puedan considerar como suyas, como valor.
What I would say is it doesn't cost any more money, but it's more time intensive. It's a different approach to working with communities. You've got to kind of, you know, I talked about those kind of values, core values in the organization, and one of them was just that trust and listening. And it does take more time, and it does take more energy, and it takes more focus, and it can be more draining if you don't have that right support. It's worthwhile if you believe in it, it's worthwhile. But in terms of money wise, I don't think it costs a lot more. It's just a different way of approaching things. Rachel.
yeah, I guess I think I agree. Like, I don't think necessarily costs more. I think it can take more time, which I guess can translate into a little bit more cost, but actually it's more about I think being open to it, to what it needs, and being responsive to what it needs. Here at the Unicorn, we work with children and young people in the development of our professional work. And that also has required artists to be open to collaborating with their audience. In the same way that I have collaborated with audiences sort of throughout my freelance work, we're now collaborating with children in the making of work for that, like for them. So it's not testing ideas out, but actually fully embracing that. And actually, that doesn't suit all artists. Like, I obviously think they're wrong. Like, I think they should all want to do it. It's brilliant. But it's actually, for some people, you go, that's not the right fit. And then I go, well, then they're not the artists to be making work in our building, because that's the way that we're going to be making work. So it's also, I think, having to be brave with that and being bold and sort of setting out and going, that is how we're going to work now.
Muy bien. Otra pregunta para los dos, podéis responder. ¿Podéis hablarnos de alguna colaboración internacional que hayáis realizado o proyecto que conozcáis en el ámbito de la inclusión y la diversidad?
On international partnerships, not kind of developed work. Like I've said before, have toured work internationally, and certainly that has kind of and sort of, you know, presented work at festivals, which has definitely sort of had ripple effects of cultural shifts, I suppose. I think we are, I mean, you know, we are obviously at risk also currently as a country, as the UK, of becoming even more of an island, and I'm really keen that we continue to develop those partnerships. So yeah, it's a really big part of what I want the future to look like, certainly.
I think with National Theatre Wales, we did work with a lot of international artists, or a fair amount of international artists on our shows. And one thing I mentioned in my talk is that we kind of expected our partners to buy in to how we worked around diversity and inclusion as well. So we kind of saw it on that level, and we also learned a lot. I get the feeling that, you know, there's countries which are probably further along the line in some ways of thinking than the UK. But I think one place we did develop really strong links with First Nations artists and Indigenous artists in Australia. And myself and the artist Gavin Porter, who did Circle of Biffs, we went over there and learnt a lot. And a lot of creatives from Australia, First Nations creatives from Australia, came over to Wales and saw what we were doing as well. So it was a really strong link there. We didn't actually make any big work together, but it was more of a real strong exchange of ideas and learning from each other.
Sounds amazing. A question for Rachel. Rachel, can you talk more about the idea of imperfect access? The person that is asking this question says he works in creating access for cross disabilities, but sometimes, unfortunately, they feel that some groups get left out.
But I guess I've got a couple of, well, one example I used to do a lot of work in drama schools, in actor training schools, looking at access across actor training. And I'd work with teachers where they'd kind of go, I see the whole group of students as a room full of individuals, and my training is really catered to each of these individuals. And then you sort of give them the idea of putting a disabled student into that room, and what they'd see is a group of students and a disabled person that they somehow had to treat in a different way. And I think my idea in a way of imperfect access is that we have to go, the world isn't like there's not one size fits all. I can make work which uses creative captions, but like really truly not any one aspect of a piece of work is 100% for everybody. We're all going to have subjective experiences, and we have subjective experiences of access, and we are different people. I am different from Devinda, who's different from Marta. Our experiences as artists, as makers, as audiences are going to be different. And so I sort of try to fully embrace that idea in the approach to access. We're not going to get it right all of the time, and to sort of be forgiving to ourselves about that, and to try and embrace that as part of a creative process. I think also, like, one of the things that gets complex with the idea of creative access is fundamentally access is also a tool. It is a practical tool and should be so. It needs to serve particular things. However, so does, to some extent, you know, lighting. We need the lighting to be on to be able to see the actors, and we experiment with these forms. And I think there's also something in there about being able to invite ourselves to be able to be playful and also still continue to be kind of practically rigorous about how to use access in these creative spaces. Hopefully that answers it a bit.
Pace, yeah. Pace. You got it. A question for Devinda. I'm going to do it in Spanish, okay? Devinda, nos gustaría mucho que nos explicases cómo gestionáis la participación de las comunidades en la toma de decisiones, porque, como digo, yo creo que eso es un gran reto para las organizaciones culturales, ¿no? Que las significa de verdad y las hace accesibles, cercanas, modernas, ¿no? Y públicas. Si nos puedes contar, por favor.
Yeah, so as I said in the presentation, we really want to open up the whole organisation to the people of Wales. And the way we did that was, I think, they could influence decision making at a number of different levels. So at the top level, we had people from the community who were represented on our board. And a board is a group of people in any case, but this was someone who perhaps wouldn't have that experience of being a board member. So they would be on there. What we also had was a group of people called Team. Now, Team was our approach to engagement, and there was a panel called Team Panel, which were a group of people from all over Wales who kind of acted like a board as well. And I guess it was just a bit more fun than the board. It was a group of people who would get together and have a say at that level of the board level, but they'd also sit in on, for example, sit in on our interview panels for when we recruited someone. They'd also sit in on company meetings where decisions were made about the day-to-day stuff. They'd get that experience there, and that kind of whole opening up of the organization. They'd come to rehearsals and tell us what they thought of our shows. And that, one thing I would say about that, it's great in principle. Every single level of the organization is open up, but to get perhaps a different kind of voice or different kind of person on there, they also need to be supported. So they need the appropriate training to be able to go to a board and make those decisions. But what I also wanted was people to be honest about it, like that honest response to why NTW wants to do, National Theatre Wales wants to do a show in this place. You know, that kind of honest response you would get from someone from the community who probably doesn't have to think about, you know, perhaps the artistic community. They're not part of the artistic community, and that is like a really honest approach. But what I would say is that it's great, and you get some really good different views, but you also need to make sure that you support anyone so they are in a position to make those decisions and not feel overwhelmed by the whole process. If that answers the question.
Sure, yeah, perfectly. Una última pregunta, si queréis, antes de acabar, para los dos también. Cuando hay financiación pública en un proyecto privado, cultural, ¿cómo creéis o desde dónde creéis que se puede abordar la diversidad y la inclusión? Lo habéis explicado más o menos en vuestras presentaciones, pero así 3 grandes rasgos o 3 tips.
So just to clarify, for when we're making projects that use public money, is that yeah?
Sí, como que el hecho de tener un soporte de dinero público obliga o condiciona en alguna manera a tener la diversidad y la inclusión muy presente en la organización, en la forma de trabajar, de crear, etcétera.
So here actually, interestingly, although we are both in the UK, Devinda and I both have different Arts Council funding bodies. So Wales has their own funding body and England has a different Arts Council. So while we actually exist under different funding structures, however, each of the Arts Council funding bodies in the UK will have diversity and inclusion absolutely built into the funding aims or the funding requests. We have something here with the Arts Council called investment principles. I'm actually, for some artists, controversially quite a big fan of those, because I think actually, yeah, we kind of need to be held to account. We do need structures to encourage artists and organizations to extend and expand their ways of working around diversity and inclusion. It's for some organizations, things like quotas or targets can feel like they're being pushed to make work that considers diversity and inclusion as part of it. But I think for those of us who are making work where we already consider those things, we kind of meet those the requirements of the arts councils or our funding bodies, or we meet those naturally. We meet them already. Yeah. Devinda, I'm not sure I've answered the question, but
no, I think you have. I think I actually sit on Arts Council Wales's board, so I'm really keen that there's certain priorities. I believe if you're getting funding, public funding for certain projects, there's certain priorities you need to pursue. This is my personal sort of my own kind of interpretation of things. And I think what I would say in Wales happened for a long time is that issues around diversity and stuff didn't really happen. I think a lot of people were paying lip service and saying, of course, it matters. It's the most important thing for us, but it didn't really happen. And I kind of feel that it's an input. If you are getting public money for the majority of projects, it should be a really integral part of your work. At least pay some mind to it. And I think you should be held accountable for it as well. If you have a sizable amount of public money and you don't pay attention to diversity or access in any way, then I think you should be called out on it, because I believe that that there is a bottom line on access and diversity, and you need to reach that at least.
Eso es lo que queríamos escuchar. Es lo que queríamos escuchar. Gracias. 3 minutos más. Nos insisten sobre la mediación para ambos. Ya sé que habéis hablado un poco del espíritu que está detrás de la mediación cultural, pero nos preguntan algunas compañeras si podéis especificar más cuántas personas, qué roles tienen, cuáles son sus tareas. Cuando habláis, sobre todo de Devinda, de facilitar recursos económicos a los colectivos, ¿cómo procedéis? Si nos podéis poner algún ejemplo concreto. Y el presupuesto.
One thing was really I meant to say in this, and when I talked about Digabe, was the community had a real say over the budget, because the artistic director at the time told me, and I've always remembered this, is if they don't control the budget, they don't control anything. And that always stuck to me, has stuck with me. So in terms of the show budget, the artists would, have quite a big say in, how that budget was spent. There'd always be a certain amount allocated to work with the community, and whether that's a larger amount or a smaller amount depends on your view of that kind of work. What I specifically refer to is when we first started and giving communities some money to start up their own projects, and all we asked for, it would benefit their community. It was a small amount of money, and this was something to do with trust. Because when I first suggested this, our funders were like, "No, God, you can't do this," because I wasn't going to ask for receipts or anything to show how they spent the money. But it was about, say, £250. And that's a lot of money to just start up your own project. But every single person who took that money gave me receipts. That whole kind of trust, like no one took that money for granted. And so from a small thing like that was more about trust and letting people do what they want. because they knew their communities better for us. So from that small level doing their own thing to it might be tens of thousands of pounds on a huge show which is dedicated to just work with the community. It depends on the situation, but there's always as much money as I can get to which go to communities. That's it.
Gracias. Y para cerrar, la última, para los dos. Hay que tener en los equipos, tienen que tener las personas alguna habilidad especial o destreza para poder trabajar la diversidad y la inclusión en los espacios?
Yes and no. I think you have to have a certain attitude, certain values, certain things you hold to be important, and you can learn the rest. I think if you have that, I think there's a lot of training you can do, and for some people that's useful. I think and for some people you're already telling them what they already know, what they've lived, like they have lived experience and stuff. So it depends very much on the person, but I think what I said in my presentation about leadership and how the values of leadership trickle down through an organization. If people in the organization are clear what the leadership stance is around diversity and access, and that stance is a certain stance, they'll learn very quickly. That's it. Rachel, I'm sure you got more to say.
I agree. I think
Rachel.
yes and no, the same. I think though, obviously I think training is important and can be in around particular areas. I think lived experience is important and can be in particular roles. I talked about Nothing About Us Without Us in terms of making work for disabled audiences, and so I would always consult with people who have lived experience of being deaf or visually impaired, or experiences that are held in the show as part of making work. I think there's an organization in this country called Attitude is Everything, which works with access in the music industry. And for me, that's really, really true. So much of this is also about attitude, about being open, and about being engaged in the same search as all of us for work that is I think about making work and that is the world that we want to live in. And I think for me that is really kind of part of it. If we all have the attitude that is making work that is the world that we want to live in, then for me that's kind of more important, or as important as any of the training we can get people to do.
Maravilloso. Pues hasta aquí lo dejamos. Deciros que todos los ponentes os dan las felicitaciones por vuestros proyectos maravillosos. Yo creo que esto ha sido un principio, ¿no?, de inspiración y de motivación. Y tanto Rachel como Devinda, muchísimas gracias por compartir vuestro conocimiento, sobre todo vuestra experiencia, con todas nosotras y todos los participantes. Ha sido, la verdad, para mí ha sido muy alentador y me ha dado mucha luz. Yo estoy seguro que a los participantes también. Y gracias al British Council de nuevo. Y bueno, pues tenemos una próxima cita el lunes que viene. En este caso vamos a hablar de sostenibilidad con Lara Sedgwick de Theatre Green Book y con Ruth Stringer de EcoStage. Recordar que será a las 4 de la tarde, hora del Reino Unido, 5 de la tarde, hora española, y os esperamos a todas y a todos. Rachel, Devinda, thank you so much and hope to see you soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.